Hi, I'm Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker. I think it's wonderful that Diane has pivoted to podcasts because it allows her to go deeper and longer with an individual guest and to really sort of unpack more than you're able to do in a traditional radio segment. So I think it's a great format for an interviewer as skilled as Diane, and it gets us to still have a connection with her. I know that Diane loves having you as a listener, and if you feel so moved as to donate, it's easy to do. You just go to dianerehm.org/donate.
Hi, it's Diane. On my mind, how the war is playing out inside Russia. Fighting in Ukraine enters week 4, with Russian army advances slowing and the shelling of civilian targets increasing. But in Russia, Vladimir Putin continues to refer to the invasion as a special military operation. The Kremlin's line has become the only version of the war most Russians believe, amid a crackdown on independent media. And in a speech on Wednesday, Putin seemed to threaten his own population against opposition. Julia Ioffe is a Russian-born American journalist. She's covered politics and world affairs for The Atlantic. She's currently a writer and founding partner of the media company Puck. I talked with her Thursday about how the Kremlin is framing the war and what it means for the future of Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine's president's speech this week to the U.S. Congress was very, very powerful. Will any of it, any portion of it, get through to the Russians themselves?
I think it will get through to those Russians who want to see it. And I think that's true in general of information regarding this war. The people who want to see what's actually going on, to get real news of the war, can do so through technologies like VPNs, which mask their location so they can get around the blocks that the Russian state has put on certain websites. But it's kind of preaching to the choir. You know, these are the people who want to know about what's actually going on about the war are generally people who don't like Vladimir Putin and who don't support the war and think it's, you know, an absolute abomination.
Now, isn't that more a group of younger people than the older ones?
Yeah, generally it's a group of younger people because, again, it requires a certain mastery of technology, right? Older people, especially older people who don't live in the big cities, who are maybe less educated and less worldly, they might not know what a VPN is. They might barely be able to use the internet. And so for them, traditionally, the television has been their main source of news, and the television is the first thing that Vladimir Putin set out to control when he came to power over 20 years ago.
I wonder if you saw Putin's speech calling for, quote, self-purification of our society. Boy, if that doesn't sound like Nazi Germany, I don't know what does.
Well, I think it sounds like, you know, something closer to home for the Russians. It sounds like the terror and the purges of the Stalin era. You know, when he talked about the fifth column, about scum who don't support the war, who earn money in Russia but live abroad and are not Russian by mentality, and that the Russian people would spit them out like a gnat that had flown in their mouth, and that we needed to purge and cleanse the country. To me, as somebody from the place, somebody who studied the place, it sounded like a prelude to purging people, like sending people to, you know, what Russia has vast experience with, sending millions of people to the gulag. And I think that's probably what it was meant to evoke, and probably it's what it did evoke. If you think about the scale of the terror and the purges, it's estimated that 20 million people passed through the gulag during its existence. So that means everybody in the former Soviet Union was in some way touched by the terror, right? Somebody has an ancestor who disappeared, or somebody who did time in the Gulag and came back. I know my family is no exception. We definitely have people who were affected by it. So I think that's what it was meant to evoke. And I think it's interesting because Vladimir Putin does this a lot, and he has done this a lot during his presidency. Until now, and I don't know if we will see a wide purge or if this is just a threat meant to scare people into submission. Until now, what he's done is, instead of doing, arresting tens of thousands or millions of people as Stalin would have done, he kind of just relies on that historical memory and targets the arrests. So for example, after the protest movement of 2011, 2012, he had a few dozen people arrested and given jail terms. And it was almost like each person was a token of a certain group. There was a senior citizen and a communist and a teacher, and just to show people that this could be you. And it worked like magic, and people stopped coming out into the streets in such numbers for many years. He has Stalin's legacy to fall back on, that he doesn't have to do all that work anymore. He can just kind of gesture at it, and people will know exactly what he means and be quiet.
So did you see the young woman holding up the poster on Russian television and declaring that, in fact, it was a war against Ukraine? Do we know what's happened to that young woman?
We do. She was an editor at Channel One, and she was detained immediately. And for a while, her lawyers couldn't find her. Then she was tried very quickly and released. There were basically two cases opened against her. The first was for holding up that sign and barging into the broadcast with it. And that one is still pending and could send her to jail for up to 15 years. The case she was already tried on and the verdict already came out on it was regarding the video that she had pre-taped, and that human rights activist that she had gotten in touch with played as soon as she was arrested and kind of did her protest. It was a kind of explanation of who she was and where she stands and why she did what she did. So for that, she was fined the equivalent of something like $240, which is a lot of rubles these days because the ruble has completely tanked. But that one felt like a slap on the wrist. We still have yet to see what they do with her for the case with the protest, the actual protest. Do they send her to jail for 10 to 15 years, or do they also fine her? It's tough because since that protest happened, a lot of reporting is coming out of Russia. A lot of anonymous employees of these Kremlin TV stations, radio stations are telling reporters that there's a lot of discontent in these newsrooms, that these are people who themselves have access to information from the West, and they see what's happening in Ukraine. They see what the Russian army is doing, and they also see what they're telling their own population, and how, to put it mildly, how widely it diverges from the truth. And so there's a lot of discontent. A lot of very prominent anchors are quitting and just saying, I'm doing it to spend more time with my family. But everybody kind of knows why, because they're all doing it within these last 2 weeks. And so it'll be interesting to see how the state approaches Marina Ovsyannikova, the woman who came out with the poster. Do they give her a heavy sentence to scare others back into silence and to make an example of her? Or do they give her a slap on the wrist and encourage other people to do the same?
Interesting. The question of those people who live in Ukraine and have relatives in Russia, are they continuing to communicate with each other? And are those kinds of communications getting any semblance of truth into the minds of older Russians?
I think it depends. I've heard of some cases where there is communication and they're getting the message across, they're getting the truth across. I've also heard of many cases where, many cases actually, of Russians choosing to believe the television over their own relatives in Ukraine, and in some cases blocking them and refusing to talk to them further, which is really, I mean, phenomenal, right? That you don't believe, for example, there was a young man who is based in Ukraine. He was telling his father back in Russia what was happening, and his father chose to believe Kremlin TV and refused to keep talking to his son. And there are a lot of cases like that.
But what about the mothers in Russia who are being informed of the deaths of their sons?
Well, I don't know how the extent to which they're being informed of the death of their sons. You know, the Russian Ministry of Defense has only confirmed 498 combat deaths. There was a piece in the New York Times the other day that said that US intelligence estimates Russian casualties to be somewhere around 7,000 combat deaths, which is more than the US lost in, 20 years in Afghanistan and more than we lost in Iraq. But if you aren't telling people, if it's just about, we just can't get in touch with him, or he's missing in action, after 2014, when bodies started to come home from the fight in the Donbass, this kind of the war that broke out, that Russia fomented in eastern Ukraine in 2014, there were mercenary companies like Wagner, which is run by Putin's former caterer and chef, that were recruiting men in very poor towns and villages where there was no other employment opportunities. And so they would go and join Wagner, and then their bodies would come home and Wagner wouldn't pay them what they said they were going to pay them. And so there was a lot of discontent. And some Russian journalists tried to show up at the funerals and tape them. And, state security people would turn up and beat them up and slash their tires. And what the Kremlin did was they classified reporting on combat deaths as a state secret. And that if you report on combat deaths that haven't been announced by the Ministry of Defense, you are releasing classified information and are therefore, liable and could get a jail sentence. And that, plus now this new law that reporting quote unquote fake news about the war, i.e. anything that diverges from the Kremlin line, can get you in jail for 15 years. I think people are hearing that, at least for now. Anecdotally, I have a friend whose mother is from a small village, small town in Siberia. And within the first week of the war, they got their first coffin. And when my friend's mother asked about this, are they upset? Are they going to talk about it? And they said, we're not going to talk about it, because it carries a penalty if we do. I don't know how long that's possible. Does it reach a kind of critical point where there's so many mothers and so many wives who haven't heard from their sons or husbands, or, have gotten a body bag or a coffin? But I think two things. First, there are reports that the Russian army has mobile crematoria that it's been using. So it's easier to say somebody, was missing in action if you just get rid of the evidence. And the other thing is that here Putin, I think, is also trying to rely on a kind of historical memory. And it's the same thing that he said yesterday in his speech about sanctions. Like, it's going to be hard, but we're going to tighten our belts and we're going to do this because we're suffering for a great cause. And if you think about World War II and the fact that 27 million Soviets died in World War II, the Soviet Union lost 15% of its population in 4 years and is proud of it now. There's this kind of, we have to sacrifice for.
We have to do what we have to do in order to maintain what we believe in and for the freedom, quote, of our own citizens. The United States has been termed the aggressor, has undermined everything by its Western values, and those are the values that Putin absolutely abhors. Do the Russian people have any idea that Putin has gone to China for assistance?
I don't know. The Kremlin has denied it. I don't know if it's getting any play internally, but watching the Kremlin news, I do see that they do play up the whole partnership with China and how Russia and China are teaming up to finally stick it to the American bully. And yesterday in Putin's speech, you heard him talk about how the US acts like it speaks for the world when actually Russia and China and several other countries represent more than half the world's population. So aren't they worth listening to? So that does get a lot of play, the partnership with China, and how with their help and through this kind of alliance, they can push the American bully back.
Now a quick break. When we return, the rest of my conversation with Julia Ioffe. Hi, it's Diane. For the March meeting at the Diane Rehm Book Club, I'll host a conversation with author Amy Bloom about her new book, In Love, a memoir of love and loss. It's Friday, March 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Find out more and register at dianerehm.org/book club. And we're back. Here's the rest of my conversation with Julia Ioffe, writer for and founding partner of the media company Puck. What about news of, for example, the bombings of a hospital, of a theater, where women, children are hidden as far down as possible, the buildings where families live and the bombings of those? Does that news get through to Russia in the sense that there are photographs or film and then explained in a very different way?
So the way it's being explained is that these are all false flag operations. The maternity hospital bombing was explained as the Azov battalion, which is a kind of very far right kind of neo-Nazi battalion that was folded into the Ukrainian National Guard after 2014, that they had commandeered the hospital a few days earlier, kicked out all the patients, and then started firing from there on Russian positions, and Russia had to retaliate. And then when they did, they brought in crisis actors made up to look like bombing victims to make Russia look bad. Of course, this is not true at all, but when it's told to Russians, a lot of them believe it because, and this should not be strange or surprising to Americans who know, for example, how many Americans have gotten up in the QAnon conspiracy theory, or the idea that January 6th was actually Antifa members dressed up as Trump supporters, or that actually Trump won the election in 2020. It's telling, I think, because people will believe a lot so that they can stick to their priors and so that they don't have to confront the reality. With the theater, yesterday, the Russian Ministry of Defense has already said that the Azov battalion had bombed the theater to make Russia look bad. Of course, also not true. But, I spoke the other week with a man named Denis Volkov, who is a sociologist and a pollster who works with the Independent Levada Center, which is the oldest and best sociological and polling organization in Russia. And he said that what they're seeing in some of their focus groups is, he told me about one woman who said, of course, I know that I could watch the BBC and I would find out different things, and then I would have a totally different understanding of what's going on, but I don't want to because, you have a certain construct, you have a certain understanding of how the world works, what your country is, how you fit into it, and you don't want to have that crumble. You don't, who wants to be the citizen of a country that is committing war crimes? Nobody wants to think of themselves or their country as bad. And people will go to great lengths to self justify and to explain away the bad things that they do or the bad things that their government does.
But Julia, amid all of this reversing of responsibility, if you will, are there any cracks beginning to show? And if so, what are they? Where are they? How are they created?
So far, I think the only crack we've seen, and we've only been in this war for 3 weeks, but we're already seeing cracks in the state broadcasting apparatus. A lot of prominent television hosts have resigned, and these are people who have done the work of propagandizing to the Russian people. Some have even escaped to the West. There seems to be a lot of discontent in these newsrooms, but so far they're still, except for the people who have quit, so far they're still doing their jobs. They're still lying to their own citizens. The question is whether this kind of discontent translates to anything bigger, or if it doesn't. I mean, some of it, I have to say, on one hand, it makes me hopeful. On the other hand, it makes me think of all of the, anonymous Trump administration sources who would tell reporters, I was so mad, I almost resigned, right? But they didn't, and they kept doing the work. So until we really see a crack, I think it's best to not look too hard and not confuse what we want for what's actually happening. So far, there's great loyalty, at least on the surface.
You were, I gather, actually born in Russia. Are you able to be in touch with your own friends? I don't know if you have relatives who are still there. And if so, what kind of reaction you're hearing from them?
So, yeah, I was born in Moscow, which was then the capital of the Soviet Union. Until recently, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, lived in Moscow in the same house where I was born and grew up, and who I lived with when I lived in Moscow when I went to visit. Sadly, she died in December of 2020 of COVID, and I was really, grief-stricken when that happened. But now watching this, I am so thankful every day that she's not around to witness this. She was part of dissident circles in the Soviet Union. In 1991, when the putsch happened, she was up on the barricades. She was up on the barricades in 1993. She went to pretty much every protest. Now, much of her favorite media has been shut down. Her favorite NGO, Memorial, which was founded in the 1980s, the first Russian NGO which was founded to document Stalin's crimes, was dismembered and disbanded. And this, I mean, I'm just glad she's not here to see this. Her father is from Odessa. I took her to Odessa and we hung out with her cousin there. And now, there's Russian warships firing on the city.
And can you get through to your cousins and other friends?
Yeah, I can. Most of my friends have fled. They fled within the first week of the war. And they are people who are my age, maybe a little bit younger, who, are the creative class. They're the journalists, the photographers, the designers, the restaurateurs, the theater people, and they all fled. And something like 200,000 at least Russians fled in that first couple of weeks. So they're all kind of stranded abroad now. They can't access their bank accounts back in Russia. So they're kind of whatever they had with them, that's what they have. So family friends who are older most of them are choosing to stick it out in Russia, or some of them are. I think there's a sense of, we survived the Soviet Union, we survived the 1990s, we survived Putin. We'll figure this out too. Although some are planning to leave. What I keep thinking about is Ukraine is being literally destroyed with bombs and artillery. Russia is also being destroyed in this kind of softer way. I just keep thinking about Moscow, which is a city I love so much. I think about it as my happy place, and it's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. All those people are gone. Everything is shutting down. And I keep thinking, in 2021, Moscow restaurants got 9 new Michelin stars. That's the kind of city it was. And I think this year, we're already seeing people fighting over sugar. It's a drastic change.
What is Putin's goal here? Where do you see him going, Julia?
I think that's the most frightening question of all. I don't know that he knows where he's going. I think he's backed into a corner and he's raging, as we saw in his speech yesterday. His goal is clearly to subjugate Ukraine, to dismember it, and to turn it into a vassal state, the way that Belarus is. He doesn't think it's a real country, and he thinks that Ukrainians are basically Russian. And we're seeing Ukrainians show what a miscalculation that was every single day as they fight to not be part of Russia. But I think the more the Ukrainians are fighting back and doing so with incredible bravery, the more Putin is punishing them for his own miscalculations, for his army's failures. He's bombing theaters and maternity hospitals, and it's this very clear strategy of trying to bomb an entire population into submission, to kind of not just fight the army, but to fight the citizens, to fight the women and the children. And I worry that he won't stop until either somebody stops him or until he has annihilated all of Ukraine, until there's no building standing and nobody left to fight, or until people are so dispirited that they'd rather just stay alive and be part of Russia than to die and be part of Ukraine.
What would stop him, or could?
I don't know. I think the other thing that's very scary to me, and it's apparent from his most recent speech and from watching Russian state TV, is that the conversation isn't even so much about Ukraine. It's about the US. Russia and Putin are treating this as a proxy war with the US, which in some ways it is, right? We're sending a lot of weapons to the Ukrainians. We're supporting them politically. But it seems like they're itching for a bigger fight, that they want some kind of confrontation with the US. And what I'm worried about is that they will try to, as much as they're warning the US off and saying, don't you dare get involved militarily in Ukraine, they kind of want it. And I worry that they'll do something either on purpose or by accident to drag in NATO so that they can finally have their showdown with the US. And it's something that I've heard so much in Moscow since 2014 among these kind of far right loyalist circles, this kind of almost millenarial eschatological craving for a final battle, civilizational battle between Russia and the US, which they believe Russia will win. And that to me is the scariest thing.
You're implying he is getting closer and closer to Poland for just that reason, to provoke perhaps the US.
Maybe, I don't know. I think that that strike that you're referring to was specifically targeted at a base where American trainers had stayed, military trainers, and they had been evacuated right before the war. I saw that as a kind of stay away, this is ours message, but I can see it. And I think a lot of Russia watchers are worried that this will spill past Ukraine because Putin kind of wants it to.
The President Joe Biden has said he does not want to monitor airspace because that would be part of exactly what you're referring to, somehow prompting Putin to say, well, there you have it. Now we can use our most lethal weapons to defend the homeland of Russia. And that could mean a third world war. Do you think he might want to go that far?
Well, I think Joe Biden is right that closing the airspace over Ukraine, creating a no-fly zone, I mean, what that entails is NATO planes shooting down Russian planes. And that is a military confrontation with Russia. That is a battle with Russian forces. But I do think that Putin wants a World War III. Again, I think he wants this kind of final battle. And I also think, I mean, we know from a lot of sources how isolated he is, how bad the intelligence is that he gets because he's surrounded by yes men and people who are scared of him or who want to please him. Because we also know that he's kind of drinking his own Kool-Aid. And what I keep thinking about is the cult of World War II that he's created, using it as this kind of binding national story that can unite a pretty diverse population, and elevating Stalin as somebody who defeated the Nazis, as somebody who led this great nation to victory against all odds. And I keep thinking, does he want his world war? Does he want his Stalin moment too? The Soviet flag over the Reichstag moment. And I worry that he does.
What about the sanctions that have been imposed so far? Are they doing any good?
I mean, they're having an effect. The ruble has crashed. Pretty much every Western company has pulled out of Russia. You see videos of these shopping malls that Russians love, that were full of stores like Zara and H&M and Apple stores, and every storefront is now shuttered. I think first it's hitting, the upper middle class, and a lot of my friends are saying, this is what always happens, damn it. They hit the pro-Western people first, the people who have the money to buy foreign goods, the people who appreciate them, who want them because they travel, they know what they are. But we're seeing already, old women, pensioners, and pensions are very small, and they've just been decimated by the ruble just tanking. The ruble is floating around 115 to the dollar. When I lived there a decade ago, it was 30 to the dollar. So if pensions were miserly before, now they buy even less, and prices are going up like crazy. They're starting to affect everyday Russians who aren't wealthy, who don't travel or who didn't travel a lot, who didn't buy a lot of foreign goods. We're seeing videos come out of even Moscow, which is the wealthiest place in Russia, of old women fighting over sugar in supermarkets. And I keep thinking these women were around for the first time that this was going on. They must be relying on kind of muscle memory of, the 1980s and empty stores and fighting over the last bag of whatever, the last can of pickled sea kelp. So it's clearly already starting that every day people are starting to feel it. Medicines are disappearing from shelves. Certain food products are disappearing. And prices on basic goods are skyrocketing.
So as all that gets worse, do you see any pressure from the oligarchs or the ordinary people building pressure against Putin for continuing this war? And would that matter?
I think they will strangely, or I think they ironically will take longer to break with him because they are oligarchs because Putin allows them to be oligarchs. They're not oligarchs on their own. If they have billions, it's because Putin has allowed them to keep them. And in many ways, in all ways, their fortunes are tied to Putin and his pleasure. So we've seen some oligarchs come out and in very veiled terms say we're for peace, which is very, very wishy-washy. Everybody's for peace. I think Putin would say he's for peace. Their yachts are being seized, but again, they have so much money and their fortunes are so tied to Putin's fate that I think many of them will go down with the ship, or maybe, they'll jump. But I don't even know if they're the ones to watch. I think people in the military might be the ones to watch. We're seeing all these intercepted calls from Ukraine because they're using insecure communications, because the secure communications that the Russian ministry developed and rolled out with great fanfare, and which of course was extremely costly because in their development so much money was stolen, doesn't work. So you're seeing Russian soldiers, commanders using regular cell phones, and the Ukrainians and American intelligence are intercepting all of them. And these people are not happy, and they've lost 3 generals and a lot of officers. And because these are the people who are seeing the reality of the war firsthand. They know that what's on TV is a lie. They're the ones seeing that they've been sent in with terrible intelligence, with terrible supply lines, with terrible machinery, and the Ukrainians don't want them there, and that they're fighting to the last bullet and the last drop of blood to keep them out. And so I think, if anything, that fracture or that rupture will come from the military.
Before we close, is there anything else you'd like to say?
It's just devastating to watch this on a personal level. I know people on both sides of the border, all of whom are horrified, including on the Russian side, by what's going on. And Ukraine, I think, will come back from this. And I really want to hope that Ukraine wins and retains some sovereignty, some form of sovereignty when this is all over. And it will rebuild. They will get a lot of help. But Russia is also being destroyed. Putin is destroying Russia too. And what makes me sad is that the Russian people have been so traumatized. I mean, the Ukrainian people have been traumatized too, but their response has been to fight for freedom at every turn and to put it all on the line for freedom, for democracy, because they know that way good things lie. The Russian people, it seems to me, and I don't want to overgeneralize, of course, there are people who fight and do wonderful work, wonderful heroic work. But for the most part, the Russian people just wanted comfort and a normal life and stability, which is what Vladimir Putin promised them. And it is a false promise because dictatorships never provide stability. And he made the cost of fighting for democracy so high that most people just gave up and figured, okay, I can live with this. In Russian, it's called internal emigration, when you kind of retreat inwards and you stop paying attention to the news because it'll just upset you. And you focus on your family and your friends and having a nice life. But dictatorships are never stable, and dictatorships never stay within their borders. And dictatorships always collapse and bring a lot of chaos in their wake.
Julia Ioffe, thank you so much for being with us. I, too, though I've only been to Russia, I am so tearful watching what's happening. So I do understand how personal this is for you. And I thank you for your reporting and for your articulation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Diane. It's been such an honor to talk to you.
That was Julia Ioffe. She's co-founder of the media company Puck and is their Washington correspondent. She previously reported on politics and world affairs for The Atlantic. And that's all for today. We welcome your feedback and suggestions. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter or send us an email, drpodcast@wamu.org. Our theme music is composed by Jim Bruntberg and Ben Landsverk of Wonderly. The show is produced by Allison Brody. Our engineer today is Adrian Danhauser. Thanks for listening all. Be well, stay safe. I'm Diane Rehm.